and welcome to Leviathan. This week we're in the Scottish Highlands as this nation celebrates its spirited performance against Brazil in the World Cup. That isn't entirely why we're here though. Our game, as usual, is looking at the history behind today's headlines. The Tartan army is sambered into submission, but why are the Scots so anti-English? Nicky Campbell thinks it all goes back 700 years. Those into the game get locked out of the game. Leviathan finds the intrepid explorers who made their way to a very different World Cup in Sweden. And as the country celebrates 50 years of Afro-Caribbean culture, we look back at Britain's first black voter in the 18th century. For many Scots, history, tribal loyalty and football are so closely woven together that they can't really be prized apart. Is it coincidence that as Scotland's football team was about to go into battle, opinion polls showed record support for independence here? But why do they hate the English so much? Was it Mrs. Thatcher, the Battle of Culloden? Well, Nicky Campbell, the Radio 5 Live presenter and medieval history graduate, thinks it goes back much further than that.
Scotland versus England, 1298.
700 years ago this summer, England scored a devastating victory against the Scots. King Edward I led an army of 25,000 men through the dense forests of central Scotland.
His opponent was William Wallace and his People's Army. People's Army, you see, New Labour speak has been around for centuries.
Wallace had set up 4 formations of long spears on a hillside. Edward's cavalry charged twice, but were held off.
Then he unleashed his longbowmen. Longbows were the stealth bombers of the Middle Ages. This was high-tech warfare, with no chance.
Thousands of Scots fell that day. We had lost the Battle of Falkirk. William Wallace, Braveheart, is best remembered for his victory at Stirling Bridge. There's a big monument set up there in his memory. But in a way, the Battle of Falkirk is even more significant.
If it hadn't been for Edward's brutal, attritional campaign in Scotland, the Scottish psyche, and hence sense of national identity, would be a very different matter. Perplexing as it is for my English friends, some of my best friends are English. Battles like Falkirk, fought centuries ago, have helped form my sense of nationhood. Don't ask me to be logical.
A goal for Scotland!
Our dislike of the English and our rejoicing in every victory we score against them can be traced back to this defeat hundreds of years ago. It's the drug of history. At Euro 96, when Germany played England, the pubs of Scotland were full of Scottish fans wearing German shirts. It's that serious.
How did you feel when Gareth Southgate missed that penalty in Euro 96?
Fantastic. I was happy when Gareth Southgate missed the penalty because there was a jingoism in England at the time and many English people were uncomfortable with that. Many, for example, black people in London were uncomfortable. Many Irish people in London, Asian people in London were uncomfortable with this extreme right-wing nationalism and jingoism that was going on during Euro 96.
You're talking about nationalism and jingoism. You want to look in the mirror?
Yeah, but we're not going to conquer anybody.
Our own sense of nationhood sprang from the conflict between Edward I and William Wallace.
The seeds of this nationalism were sown in the war between these two men. And as in all wars, the first casualty is the truth. So here goes. This was a battle between good and evil, right and wrong, the pure and noble Scots and the wicked English.
Edward's desire to rule, to dominate my country, exposed an attitude to Scotland different from previous monarchs. He had tried to control the Scottish succession. He tried to force Scotland's new king to recognise the supremacy of English courts over our well-established legal system. He insisted we fight his wars, at that time against France, and he demanded a slice of Scotland's wool harvest. In the 70s we cried, "It's Scotland's oil." Back then, it was Scotland's wool. Not all Scots resisted, but when they did, Edward responded with overwhelming force and great brutality. At Berwick, he massacred thousands of civilians.
After one of his victorious military campaigns against us, Edward I said, "It's good to be rid of a turd." Maybe now you can understand why we don't have a good word for Edward I. Well, we do, and it's a lot better than turd.
We know few hard facts about Edward's adversary, William Wallace. In fact, there's no contemporary image of him. His biography was written at least 150 years later by the renowned poet Blind Harry. It was largely a work of propaganda. So who can tell the accuracy of Harry writing that the English murdered Wallace's wife and that Wallace captured York? Wallace's run of successes against the English only lasted 1 year before it was ended at Falkirk.
He's the most important man in Scottish history. It's as simple as that. He showed great military
More than
tactics.
Kenny Dalglish?
Yes, more so. I mean, Kenny Dalglish...
More than Joe Jordan?
Great players, but as managers, I don't think they were as good. I mean, William Wallace was a great manager.
Wallace's love of his country did him little good. After Falkirk, he gave up his leadership of Scotland. A few years later, he was captured, taken to London, and barbarously executed.
What motivated him?
Ooh.
And what would his answer be?
I think he
Top
would.
line,
I
headline.
think he would. It would be, you know, it would be the freedom thing, because that's how you translate it. Whether it was because you didn't like taxation, you know, or whatever, at the end of the day, you'd say because it's wrong. What the English are doing is wrong.
I am troubled by this. I'm troubled by the romanticism which underpins the Wallace myth. I'm troubled by the myth-making of Blind Harry and Mel Gibson. I'm troubled by it, but I choose to swallow it. Hook, line, and sinker. Well, we weren't going to kick out the tyrannical English by forging a peace process.
Everyone had to be ruthless in those days. I mean, William Wallace was not exactly a fairy or anything like that. He was not a nice guy, you know.
Wash your mouth out with soap and water.
I know, and the hate mail too.
It means that much to me that having watched Braveheart many times, I have never watched the last 10 minutes. Because I couldn't bring
The torture scene when he was hung drawn at quarter.
Couldn't watch that.
You can't bring yourself to watch that?
No, I can't watch the last 10 minutes.
Bit. That's when your heart is swelling with pride for being Scottish, the last 10 minutes. Because he refused, faced with his own entrails, you know what a gruesome torture that was. He refused to swear an oath of homage and fealty to the English king. He still wouldn't do it.
At the end of the day, if you don't see somebody die, their spirit lives on. So therefore he's
But
immortal.
it was Mel Gibson.
But though dead, Wallace had done enough. His brave resistance inspired us. We Scots went on to victory led by Robert Bruce. In 1314, King Robert defeated the English at the Battle of Bannockburn. My country had won its independence. It lasted 4 centuries. Our national hero was William Wallace. Isn't it pathetic? We sing Flower of Scotland at football and rugby matches with its lines about fighting for your wee bit hill and glen, sending proud Edward's army home again. I sing it, and I cry. Figure that one out.
Proud Edward's army, and send him homeward to think again. Those hills are bare.
Out of the medieval mists has come an ever more powerful symbol of Scottish independence, William Wallace. After the Union, he became an inspiration to oppressed Scots everywhere. When the Falkirk miners formed a trade union last century, they called themselves the Sir William Wallace Grand Lodge. They're still going today.
He was a freedom fighter himself, and the miners was fighting for freedom from the coal owners in days gone by.
They were virtually serfs when this lodge was formed in 1863.
There were women working in the pits and it was just slavery.
Male children were actually sold to the pits for a shilling.
So Wallace, well, they let Scotland be free, so could you know got a better patron saint than Wallace? Free the colliers.
Let's play a bit of virtual history. What if? What if Edward I had never existed? If Edward I had never existed, William Wallace would have been historically unnecessary, and the wars of independence would never have happened.
For much of the 13th century, England and Scotland got along. Scottish nobles owned land on both sides of the border. The kings of the two countries were closely related. The English recognised the independence of the Scottish crown, albeit in a big king, little king way.
The last thing anyone would have expected was war. There's a lot of integration across border society, people intermarrying, and that's the way that countries do come together. And if Edward I hadn't been quite so brutal, the chances are that would have continued, but that was what, divided.
And the relationship between our two countries would have been on a completely different basis for the next 700 years.
I think it would have done. I mean, this real gut feeling that still continues today against the English was really created in the later 13th century. We slagged each other off a bit, but it wasn't that real powerful hatred that Edward I did create between the two countries.
Why do we feel strange, ambivalent about the English, do you think?
Very arrogant nation, I think. We seem to think that they're right and they can do no wrong. We're English. You just need to look at them when they go abroad on holiday. Just take over the places.
We're a nation. We're a cultural nation. We're a nation. We're a Celtic race. We sing, we dance, we perform. That's part and inherent of our culture. The thing about the English is, they're great Morris dancers.
Yeah.
I mean, Jimmy, Morris dancing?
Morris dancers. Here's to Morris dancing.
Here's to Morris dancing.
I love it.
If Edward I hadn't been so determined to dominate Scotland, we might have had some form of devolution a lot sooner. Instead, the next 400 years, we were an independent nation, and for 300 after that, an English satellite, a mere appendage. Northern Britain.
Now that devolution is happening, will our relationship with our southern neighbour England be more mature, more grown up, more reasonable? A Hamer Doots.
Scottish fans wearing German shirts during Euro 96. How pathetic. I tell you, to wear a Brazil strip in pride and safety round here, you have to come somewhere fairly remote. So why are we here at Glen Shiel in the Highlands? Well, it's because in this valley, a Spanish invasion force came to grief on this day in history.
Will you, muckle? Will you give me any trouble? I'll tell you now.
On June the 10th, 1719, there was a battle at Glen Shiel. A small Spanish invasion force met the British. The Stuart pretender to the throne was in exile. He'd ordered his supporters, the Jacobites, to link up with the Spanish invaders. But it was a hopeless plan. The main Spanish invasion fleet had been scattered by a storm. The clan chiefs found out what had happened at sea, so few of their followers fell in with the small Spanish landing party. Only a ragged band of outlaws headed off for Glen Shiel. The English garrison from Inverness marched out to meet the Jacobites in Spanish. The invaders' morale was brittle from the start. They were pounded and routed. The Jacobites buried their dead and bided their time. The Spanish never attempted another invasion, and the English waited for the next outbreak of trouble in Scotland, the Revolt of 1745. Watching the coverage of the arrival of the ship Empire Windrush from the Caribbean, you might think that Britain's black community was created 50 years ago. Well, obviously that's wrong. Even 250 years ago, barriers of race were being challenged by an extraordinary man, Ignatius Sancho.
I am one of those people whom the vulgar and illiberal call niggers. The first part of my life was rather unlucky. The latter part of my life has been, through God's blessing, truly fortunate. My chief pleasure has been books.
Ignatius Sancho was born in 1729 on a slave ship. By the time he got to England, aged 2, he was an orphan. There were a few thousand black faces on London streets, and by and large English society saw them as noble savages, childish, wild and unenlightened. Despite this, they could be tamed into fashionable servants for the aristocracy, and that's what Sancho became, until he found a saviour.
He was a lively and intelligent young lad, and he came to the attention of the Duke of Montague, who took him into his household and exposed him to the world of books, the world of art, because Montague wanted to know whether, if you took an uncultivated barbarian from Africa and exposed him to the norms and artifacts of Western civilization, whether Africa would leave the barbarian.
He rose to become a butler, soaking up the art and music that surrounded him. When the Duchess died, his fortunes changed dramatically. He was left £70 and a substantial pension. Sancho had become a gentleman, albeit a rather naughty one.
Sancho may have lost his ancestral culture, but he lost it in great style. When he inherited his £70, he blew it out in women and wine. You know, he once lost all his clothes at a game of cribbage with a Jewish gentleman. He was a rake. He was an 18th century rake, somebody straight out of the canvases of William Hogarth, which was peculiar because he was a black man. He would have probably been the only black rake in the 18th century, you know.
But he did finally leave the gambling behind, marrying a West Indian woman he adored and having 6 children. He first attracted public attention when he wrote to the novelist Lawrence Sterne, asking him to take a stand against slavery.
I am sure you will applaud me for beseeching you to give 1/2 hour's attention to slavery. Dear sir, think in me you behold the uplifted hands of thousands of my brother Moors.
Sancho's well-crafted letter showed he'd mastered the skills of a gentleman. This epistle artistry, his enjoyment of the harpsichord, he composed this music, and cultivation of a circle of literary and artistic friends added to his influence. To cap it all, he sat for Thomas Gainsborough.
It's the first portrait by a major British artist of an identifiable black person. It shows Sancho not as a servant, nor as a black person just sort of merging into the background, but as someone with status in a gentlemanly pose. And that is actually quite unusual.
There is a slightly mischievous smile on his face in the Gainsborough portrait, as if first of all he's saying, I am being painted by Gainsborough. But I think there's also a smile as almost as a recognition of where he's come from and where he is at the time, you know. That in fact he's almost made it, you know, he's made it.
In 1773, he opened a grocery store in Charles Street, Mayfair, selling sugar and tobacco. As a man of property, he also got the vote, the first documented British black man to do so.
It's of course very ironic that here is someone who was born into slavery, and that slavery rests on sugar, and at the end of his life he's in a shop in Westminster selling sugar. I think Sancho was aware of the ironies, but he was also a real 18th century mercantilist and felt that trade and commerce were ultimately beneficial, whilst at the same time completely hating slavery as an institution. Very difficult position for him to be in.
Despite his success in the salons, he never forgot his race, signing himself Africanus when he wrote to newspapers, and he was reminded of his colour every time he went out.
Last night, a fine evening. Good songs. We went by water, had a coach home. Were gazed at, followed, etc., etc., but not much abused.
After his death in 1780, Sancho's letters were published. They became an instant bestseller.
Sancho is a man of talent who overcame the predicament of his background in ways that very, very, very few people, writers in the 18th century, did. You know, the great description of slavery as a library. Slaves packed on board ships like books upon a shelf. Well, Sancho transformed himself from being packed like a book to being a maker of words, a maker of books.
Yours, with zeal and esteem, Ignatius Sancho.
and Sancho's letters are being republished by Penguin next week. Now, if you've tuned in to escape the football, I'm sorry, you can't. In 1958, England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales all qualified for the World Cup, the only time that's ever happened. A small group of intrepid fans set off to Sweden with strange fantasies of crisp-bred free love and beating Brazil. This is their story.
What does Sweden mean to you? The highest standard of living in the world? Free love and suicide, drunkenness and abortion? The lovely clear-cut women, blonde and statuesque? The grandeur of majestic natural scenery of 96,000 lakes?
Romping about naked in the snow and all that.
I suppose it was that illusion. We never found any of that.
Didn't find any of that, did we?
He goes by the name of King Creole. You know it's gone.
We went to Stockholm as part of the naval contingent, and we went there for the World Cup, wholly and solely for the World Cup. Marvellous.
My mother actually watched the matches on Leviathan News. Go on, Billy, score a goal. Shouting at the Leviathan News in a cinema in Belfast.
I took flags with me. I was the only person who took flags. I took a Scottish flag and I also took a Union Jack. We flew these from the bus on the way through all these countries. You see, the Union Jack was flying. We had some sort of a friendly disagreement with all these Englishmen, and Norman flung the Union Jack out of the bus in Belgium somewhere. That's why I don't have the Union Jack's gone.
Bootsman, there's a moose loose about this house.
We had two travellers from Northern Ireland by scooter. One was called Mickey McColgan, and the other was called Jim Nicholl. They travelled by scooter right to Sweden, and they pitched a tent outside the team hotel. The manager was a little incensed because you can imagine somebody pitching a tent outside the Savoy or somewhere in London. These two guys were tucked in with a Primus stove, cooking their tea.
Many a tear has to fall, but it's all in the game.
Stepping ashore, it was immediately noticeable. Everywhere was clean and people walking around with a smile on their faces.
That we know as love.
We met these two Finnish girls.
Yes, we did, yeah.
We escorted them back to their hostel. They must have been there working or something.
Okay, yeah,
of course, it was a very difficult sort of relationship because they didn't speak English and we didn't speak Finnish.
Very difficult, yeah.
Swedish girls were very attractive, but we were all there for the football.
There's such an abundance of fair-haired Saxon ladies, you know, young Saxon ladies, you know, who are very, very friendly, you know, and I was thinking, well, you know, perhaps you'd have to be there about 2 or 3 nights to know them, you know, but they were very, very faithful and they were very, very friendly, and I'll leave it at that.
A goal is scored, and not only the players but the crowd go mad.
We were paid, I think, £30 per match, and there was no spending money for the players. One of the reporters in the England group let it go that the England players were getting £2 a day spending money. So we had a meeting among the Irish players and presented our committee with the facts that England were getting £2 a day, so we should get £2 a day, and we got it.
You shake my nerves and you rattle my brain. Too much of love drives a man insane. You broke my will, but what a thrill. Goodness gracious, great balls of fire. I let you love what I thought it was funny. You came along and woo, now honey, I've changed my mind.
This side is Pele, Vava and Didi, the great Brazilian inside forward trio. Pele number 10, Pele coming away with it. What a master this boy is at 17. Pele. And number 3.
He's got a brilliant goal inside the box.
and I think he had another shot from the halfway line that hit the crossbar. His
I
youth,
believe you're right.
you know, he just looked just like a wee boy, and yet,
yes,
that he was brilliant.
Billy, and he scored in the very last minute.
When two hearts are
It was so easy to buy tickets, and all you had to do was to go to these kiosks that sold tobacco and newspapers or whatever, and they were dotted round, not only around the ground but around the city, and just get a ticket for the match and go along to the match, and that was it.
There you are, minutes away from kick-off, King of Sweden's in the stand, and suddenly this wee chap from Southampton turns up in the penalty box. We couldn't believe our eyes, and he had our ball, and he placed the ball on the spot, took a running kick, and missed.
Missed the goal completely.
Missed the goal completely. So he runs behind the goal, picks up, gets the ball, goes back again, places it on the spot, takes a running kick, and misses
a second time.
I think this happened 3 or 4 times.
I think it was his 4th shot.
And these 2 Swedish policemen strolled up and he allowed him to take his kick, and he scored. And of course, we cheered like mad. So the thing about that is that the first goal of the 1958 World Cup final was scored by an Englishman.
Set out, whatever will be, will be. The future's not ours to see. Que sera. What will be, will be. Que sera, sera.
Doris Day warbling us to the end of our day. We leave you with one of the earliest examples of a newsreel with sound. Movie Tone was invited into Downing Street by Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister, 69 years ago today. From Scotland, goodbye.
May I introduce to you the members of the Cabinet who have been chosen for very hard work, and because I believe the nation fully believes that they are perfectly competent to perform it. Still, Mr. Webb, who is looking after the dominions and the colonies, behind him was Mr. Arthur Greenwood, who is going to the Ministry of Health. There's Mr. Wedgwood Ben, he is one of the young men. Last, but most unique, is our friend Margaret Bonfield. Margaret Bonfield is a double first. She is the first woman who has been admitted into the Privy Council. She is now the Right Honourable Margaret Bonfield. She is also the first woman who has taken a seat in a cabinet. And I am sure, in the name of the whole country, I greet her to her new position and wish her well.